Turn to the economy, the broader economy, probably the predominant concern of people in this room. We seem to be stuck in an economic growth pattern of okay but not great growth. Your friend Larry Summers was here earlier today and said essentially the problem, or one of the problems, is that the system can't do two things at once. It can't cut deficits and spur growth. It needs to do one or the other. Right now, it needs to spur growth, should not worry so much about deficits. Do you agree? And if you do agree, how do you make that happen?
You know, actually, Larry and I and most of my economic team, in fact, all my economic team, have consistently maintained that there is a way to reconcile the concerns about debt and deficits with the concerns about growth. What we know is that our fiscal problems are not short-term deficits. Our discretionary budget, that portion of the federal budget that isn't defense or Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, the entitlement programs, is at its smallest level in my lifetime, probably since Dwight Eisenhower. We are not lavishly spending on a whole bunch of social programs out there. And in many ways, a lot of these programs have become more efficient and pretty effective. Defense, we spent a lot from 2001 to 2011, but generally we are stabilizing, and the Pentagon, working with me, have come up with plans that allow us to meet our security needs while still bringing down some of the costs of defense, particularly after having ended the war in Iraq and on the brink of ending the war in Afghanistan. So when we talk about our deficit and debt problems, it is almost entirely healthcare costs. You eliminate the delta, the difference between what we spend on healthcare and what every other country, advanced industrialized nation, spends on healthcare, and that's our long-term debt. And if we're able to bend the cost curve, we help solve the problem. Now, one way to do that is just to make healthcare cheaper overall. That's, I think, the best way to do it, and that's what we've been doing through some of the measures in the Affordable Care Act. There are some other provisions that we could take that would maintain our commitment to seniors, Medicare, Social Security, the disabled, and Medicaid, while still reducing, very modestly, the cost of those programs. If we do those things, that solves our real fiscal problem, and we could take some of that money, a very modest portion on the front end, and invest in infrastructure that puts people back to work, improve our research and development. So the idea would be do some things in the short term that focus on growth, do some things in the long term that deal with the long-term debt. That's what my budget reflects. That's what a multiple series of negotiations with John Boehner talked about, the so-called grand bargain. We couldn't quite get there in the end, mainly because Republicans had a great deal of difficulty with the idea of putting in more revenue to balance out some of the changes that were made on entitlements.
I would guess a lot of people in this room would say that another way to make some of those things happen would be to fix the corporate tax code that everybody agrees is a mess. You got some companies that pay way too much compared to their international competitors. Some companies don't pay at all. It's not a good system. It's not an efficient system. Everybody agrees, but it doesn't ever seem to change. Can you make it change? And can you do something about repatriation of U.S. Assets overseas?
Well, here's the good news, is that both my administration and Republicans have talked about corporate tax reform. And Paul Ryan, who's going to be coming after me, has said he's interested in corporate tax reform. And we've reached out to him and we've said, let's get to work. We put forward a very specific set of proposals that would lower the corporate tax rate, broaden the base, close some loopholes. And in terms of international companies and competitiveness, what we've said is, rather than a whole bunch of tangled laws that incentivize folks to keep money overseas, let's have a modest but clear global minimum tax get rid of some of the huge fluctuations that people experience. It will save companies money, make them more competitive, and in terms of transitioning to that system, actually allow some people to bring back money and in a one-time way help us finance infrastructure and some other projects that need to get done. I don't expect Republicans to adopt exactly the proposal that we've put forward, but there's not that much separation between what Democrats are talking about. I know Chairman Max Baucus put out something today, Chairman of the Finance Committee, what Dave Camp over in the House has talked about. This should be bridgeable. The one thing I would caution is, and I've said this to the Business Roundtable and other corporate leaders who I've talked to, people like the idea of corporate tax reform in theory. In practice, if you want to make the corporate tax reform deficit neutral,
right,
then you actually have to close some loopholes. And people like the idea of a simpler tax system until it's their particular loophole that's about to get closed. And what we can't afford to do is to keep all the loopholes that are currently in place and lower the corporate tax rate. We would then blow another hole in the deficit that would have to be filled, and what I'm not willing to do is to have higher rates on the middle class in order to pay for that.